A German fighter on British grass, Wales. June 23, 1942. Late afternoon light drapes itself across the quiet fields of South Wales. The kind of soft golden haze that makes RAF Pembrey feel a world away from the war raging across Europe. Mechanics wipe their hands on oily rags. Trainees walk the perimeter fence. The air is still, uneventful, almost peaceful. Then the sound arrives, a deep, unfamiliar growl. Not the smooth hum of a Merlin engine. This is harsher, heavier. The unmistakable thunder of a BMW 801 radial. The heartbeat of Germany's most feared fighter. Heads snap toward the sky. Out of the distant haze, a single aircraft emerges, cutting low across the field. Broad wings, stubby nose, dark camouflage, black crosses on the fuselage. It is a Focke-Wulf Fw 190, the Luftwaffe's secret weapon. Never before seen intact on British soil, and it's lowering its landing gear. RAF. Ground crew stare in disbelief as the aircraft lines up with their runway. Steady and confident, as if it belongs here, as if it recognizes this place, as if the pilot believes he's home. The wheels touch British grass. The propeller slows. The canopy slides back. And in that instant, one German pilot realizes the terrible truth. He has just delivered Germany's most prized fighter straight into enemy hands. From the Battle of Britain to the Butcher Bird. When the Battle of Britain ended in late 1940, the world believed the Luftwaffe had been stopped cold. German fighters had failed to break the RAF. Hitler turned his eyes east, and the skies over England settled into a tense, uneasy calm. But the air war didn't end. It simply changed shape. Throughout 1941, the RAF pushed across the Channel in a series of offensive sweeps. Small formations of Spitfires crossed into occupied France and Belgium, testing German air defenses, striking at airfields, and forcing the Luftwaffe to react. These were meant to keep pressure on the enemy and sharpen pilots for future battles. Instead, they triggered a brutal grinding duel over the Channel front. The RAF still flew its dependable Spitfire Mk IX, a machine many believed unbeatable after its triumph against the Bf 109. But what they didn't know, what no Allied commander yet understood, was that Germany was preparing a new answer. A different animal entirely. In the autumn of 1941, a new silhouette appeared over the French coast. At first, only glimpses. A thick-nosed fighter with a radial engine, unusual for German design, diving with astonishing speed and climbing with an almost unnatural force. It rolled faster than any Spitfire. It accelerated violently. It hit targets hard and slipped away before Allied pilots could respond. It was the Focke-Wulf Fw 190, the brainchild of designer Kurt Tank, and soon to be feared by every Allied fighter pilot in the European theater. Reports returned from RAF squadrons with a kind of disbelief. Pilots described being out-earned, outclinned, outgunned. They insisted this new fighter could dive with a ferocity no Spitfire Mk could hope to match. Some early encounters ended with entire RAF sections disappearing in seconds, their attackers appearing like sudden, violent shadows. By late 1941, the RAF had to face an unwelcome truth. For the first time since the war began, Germany had produced a fighter that surpassed the Spitfire. The Fw 190 earned a nickname in German service, Würger, the Butcher Bird, and it carried the name well. Armed with a mix of 20mm cannon and machine guns, powered by the robust BMW 801 radial engine, it was fast, fierce, and devastatingly responsive. British intelligence had fragments of information, scraps from combat reports, and guesses from performance charts. But guesses were not enough. Not when men were dying. To understand a weapon, you must hold it. By 1942, the RAF was desperate for an intact Fw 190, not a wreck pulled from a smoking crater, not scattered pieces swept from a runway. A complete, functioning aircraft. Something they could study, strip down, weigh, measure, and above all, fly. Without it, the engineers at Supermarine and Rolls-Royce were working in partial darkness, trying to design counters for a machine whose secrets remained tightly sealed. Meanwhile, over occupied France, the Luftwaffe's elite units, Jagdgeschwader 2 Richthofen and Jagdgeschwader 26 Schleideter, used the Fw-190 to dominate the Channel front. RAF squadrons were losing aircraft at an alarming rate, and morale strained under the weight of a fighter they didn't fully understand. Pilots began to dread the high-speed diving attacks that signaled Fw-190 strikes. Spitfires that tried to chase would find themselves falling behind, engines screaming in protest, while the German fighter simply pulled away, climbing, rolling, and vanishing into cloud. The war in the air had shifted, and the Allies felt it, but the Fw-190's superiority wasn't the whole story. Behind the sleek metal, behind the extraordinary performance figures, stood the people who flew. And among them was one man whose fate would take an unexpected turn, a man whose single navigational mistake would change everything. Man named Oberleutnant Armin Faber, a gifted pilot, a respected officer, an adjutant in one of Germany's most prestigious fighter units. And the unwitting courier of Germany's guarded secret. To understand how such a bizarre event could happen, how a top Luftwaffe fighter could end up landing neatly on a British runway, we must first understand the world Faber inhabited, the unit he served, and the air war unfolding over the French coast in June 1942. By the summer of 1942, JG-2 Richthofen stood as one of the Luftwaffe's most respected fighter wings on the Western Front. Its pilots carried the legacy of Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron himself, and its operational area covered the heart of occupied France's Atlantic coastline. From bases like Morlaix in Brittany, they rose daily to challenge RAF intrusions across the Channel. This was not the frenzied desperation of the Battle of Britain. This was a confident, experienced Luftwaffe, fighting on familiar ground with a machine that gave them every advantage. Among these pilots was Oberleutnant Armin Faber, serving as Gruppenadjutant of 3, JG-2. The title adjutant often misleads. It sounds administrative, and in part, it was. Faber handled paperwork, personnel matters, and operational coordination for his group commander. But adjutants were also trusted aviators, combat-proven, disciplined, and capable. They were often among the most respected pilots in their unit. Faber fit the mold perfectly. He was methodical, calm under pressure, and thoroughly trained in the Luftwaffe's aggressive dogfighting doctrine. He understood the territory, the rhythms of Channel operations, and the responsibilities of supporting his group in the air. Daily life at Morlaix followed a predictable but intense pattern. Pilots waited in dispersal huts, drinking coffee, smoking, or lounging in the summer sun until the phone rang, the scramble call. Then boots hit the ground, engines roared awake, and Fw-190s leapt skyward in tight formation, climbing into the pale French skies. Across the sea, the RAF was preparing its own daily ritual. Throughout 1942, the British intensified operations known as circus raids, bomber formations, often with a handful of light bombers and heavy escorts, sent to strike specific targets in France. The goal wasn't only destruction. It was to force German fighters into battle, to bleed the Luftwaffe, and maintain offensive pressure. Many of the escorts came from the Czechoslovak RAF squadrons -310, 312, and 313, manned by exiled Czech pilots who had fled their occupied homeland to continue the fight. These were fierce, motivated aviators flying Spitfires with skill and tenacity. Their losses were personal. Their motivation ran deeper than duty. On the 23rd of June 1942, these squadrons were among those tasked with escorting bombers across the Channel. They would soon become part of the strange chain of events that delivered a German prize into British hands. JG-2 reacted quickly. The call came to Morlex. Engines fired. Faber and his fellow pilots sprinted to their Fw-190s in seconds. The airfield shook under the roar of multiple BMW 801 engines as the fighters rolled down the runway and lifted into the sky. The weather that day was deceptively clear, bright sunlight, scattered cloud, excellent visibility, perfect for combat pilots, and perfect for mistakes in navigation once disorientation set in. JG-2 climbed to intercept altitude as the RAF formation approached. The landscape below, the rugged French coastline, the shimmering Atlantic, was familiar to them. Here, they knew the air currents, the sun's angles, the landmarks where earlier battles had taken place. For Faber, this was routine. Dozens of interceptions had begun the same way, but routine is deceptive in war. It lulls even the sharpest minds. And on that day, the stage was being quietly set for something no one in JG-2 or the RAF could have imagined. When the German formation reached the RAF bombers and escorts, the battle unfolded in a blur. Czech Spitfires dove to meet the threat. Fw-190s rolled, climbed, and attacked with the savage efficiency the aircraft was known for. In the chaos, Faber scored a confirmed victory, a moment that reinforced the confidence JG held in the Butcher Bird. But that victory came with a cost. Separation. One roll too deep. One turn too sharp. One pursuit carried too far. And suddenly, Faber was alone in the sky, with no wingman in sight and no clear visual reference to orient himself. What happened next was not a failure of skill. It was the simple, fragile vulnerability of human perception, magnified by speed, adrenaline, and the unforgiving geometry of aerial combat. As Faber turned for home, he misread the world beneath him. And with that mistake, the war in the air was about to change. Angle 1. Human: a pilot's error, fatigue, confusion, and the cost of a wrong turn. Armin Faber had flown combat missions before, but the engagement on the 23rd of June 1942 pushed him to the razor's edge of human perception. In aerial warfare, even the most seasoned pilots experience something insidious: tunnel vision. A narrowing of the mind, a tightening of the senses. The world shrinks to the enemy in front of you, and everything else fades into background blur. Faber had just shot down a skilled RAF pilot. His adrenaline was still spiking, his breathing heavy in the cockpit, the BMW 801 engine vibrating through his bones. In that moment, the battlefield around him, a wide sky of shifting positions and vanishing landmarks, became disorienting. Above the sea, disorientation is deadly. The water below becomes a mirror. The horizon blends. Coastlines look similar when glimpsed in partial glances through quick maneuvers. And in 1942, without modern navigation instruments or radar guidance for fighters, pilots relied heavily on instinct, memory, and the sun's angle. Faber believed he turned south toward France. In reality, he flew north, into the wide mouth of the Bristol Channel. The shape of the coastline, the bend of the land, the position of the sunlight, together, they played a fatal trick on his mind. He had mistaken Wales for Brittany, British soil for German-controlled territory. This wasn't incompetence. It was the inherent fragility of human navigation at 400 miles per hour, in combat, with death a few seconds away. And that fragility would deliver Germany's most prized fighter to the enemy, intact. From the cockpit of his Fw-190, Faber believed he was safe, heading back to base. On the ground below, RAF Pembrey was preparing to witness the most unbelievable landing of the war. Angle 2 technological, the secret inside the Fw-190. To understand why Faber's mistake mattered, one must understand what he was carrying. The Focke-Wulf Fw 190A3 was not just another fighter. It was a masterpiece of German engineering, the result of meticulous testing, innovation, and brutal design philosophy. Everything about it had been optimized for dominance. Its heart was the BMW 801 radial engine, a complex, powerful, air-cooled machine that delivered fierce acceleration and allowed the aircraft to dive like a stone, yet climb like a rocket. RAF engineers knew the engine existed, but they didn't understand its cooling system, its fuel mixture control, or how it maintained such high performance under stress. The airframe was equally mysterious. The Fw 190 was built to absorb damage, take hits, and keep flying. Its wide-track landing gear reduced accidents on takeoff and landing, giving German pilots confidence and stability. Its ailerons allowed lightning-fast rolls, a trait Spitfire pilots envied but couldn't match. And then there was the armament. Two 20mm Mk 151 cannons, two 20mm wing cannons, and twin machine guns in the cowl. A devastating burst that could shred a Spitfire in a fraction of a second. The RAF knew what these weapons did, but not their exact harmonization, recoil characteristics, or effective range. The cockpit layout, clean, intuitive, rugged, gave German pilots superb situational awareness. The British had no access to its sighting systems, instrument panel, or emergency controls. Every switch, lever, and gauge held tactical secrets. Until this day, the Fw 190 was an enigma, a hunter whose strengths the Allies only guessed at, and often guessed wrong. Faber's aircraft was not merely a trophy. It was a complete intelligence windfall, the key to decoding a weapon that had killed hundreds of RAF pilots. And now, without a scratch, it was gliding toward a British runway. Angle 3 tactical operational, the RAF's desperate need for answers. By mid-1942, the RAF was fighting from a position of painful disadvantage. The Spitfire Mk, once the star of Britain's defense, was now outperformed. Dogfights over France often ended in brutal losses. Pilots returned shaken, reporting the same thing again and again. Whatever that new German fighter is, we can't touch it. At RAF headquarters, frustration mounted. Engineers were working nearly blind. Intelligence officers had fragments of reports, scattered diagrams, and theories about the Fw 190's construction and engines. But without a physical aircraft to examine, every countermeasure was educated guesswork. This wasn't just an engineering crisis. It was a tactical one. RAF squadrons needed new strategies to survive. They needed to know the Fw 190's stall characteristics, dive limits, roll rate, climb profile, everything that defined how it fought. And they needed to test these traits directly against British fighters to create new combat manuals. In other words, they needed an Fw 190 to fly. There was only one problem. German fighters rarely survived combat long enough to be captured intact. Those that crashed did so at full speed, burying themselves into the earth or shattering into unrecognizable fragments. When pieces were recovered, they revealed nothing useful: twisted metal, burnt wiring, charred engines. The RAF's greatest wish was to somehow obtain a fully operational Fw 190. It seemed impossible, and yet, on a calm afternoon in June 1942, fate delivered exactly that. Not through sabotage, espionage, or battlefield victory, but through a simple navigational mistake by a skilled German officer. A mistake that would shape the next chapter of the air war. Angle 4. Intelligence and engineering, from captured relic to flying laboratory. When the Fw 190 touched down at RAF Pembrey, the British had no idea just how intact it truly was. Once secured, guarded, and reported up the chain of command, the aircraft was immediately classified as a top priority intelligence asset. Within hours, a specialized recovery team was dispatched. What they found astonished them. The Fw-1903 was practically showroom condition. No bullet holes, no landing damage, no structural stress. It was as if Germany had graciously delivered a factory-fresh fighter for evaluation. The aircraft was carefully disassembled for transport and moved under heavy security to the Royal Aircraft Establishment, RAF Pembrey, the beating heart of British aviation science. There, engineers, metallurgists, weapons specialists, aerodynamicists, and test pilots converged on the machine like surgeons around a rare specimen. Every component was catalogued, every bolt measured, every control cable traced. The British repainted it in RAF markings and assigned it a unique serial number, MP499. To prevent accidents during testing, a bold prototype, P, was painted on the fuselage, and then came the true test. Under the hands of experienced RA pilots, the Fw-190 flew again, this time over English soil, under Allied eyes. Each sortie extracted precious data: turn radius, climb rates, stall behavior, dive limits, overheating tendencies, armament recoil, and fuel consumption. The secrets Germany had guarded so fiercely were finally laid bare. A captured machine became a laboratory in the sky. And the RAF, armed with truth rather than fragments, began to rewrite its playbook for survival. Angle 5 strategic, Allied. How? One fighter helped save the Spitfire. Before acquiring the captured Fw-190, the RAF was struggling to produce a fighter capable of matching it. The existing Spitfire Mk V was outclassed, and although engineers were developing the Spitfire Mk IX with the more powerful Merlin 61 engine, the RAF had no way to know how it compared to the German threat. Now they did. At Farnborough, and later at the Air Fighting Development Unit, AFDU, at Duxford, the captured Fw-190 was pitted directly against the Spitfire Mk IX in controlled mock dogfights. What followed shaped the next 2 years of air combat. The Spitfire Mk IX could finally meet the Fw-190 on equal terms, sometimes surpassing it in climb and high-altitude performance. RAF test pilots discovered the exact conditions where each fighter held an advantage. The Fw-190 rolled faster, allowing evasive maneuvers. The Spitfire climbed better at altitude, enabling vertical tactics. The Fw-190 could dive harder. The Spitfire could turn tighter. This data transformed RAF strategy almost overnight. Squadrons were retrained using the new findings. Pilot briefings incorporated Fw-190 characteristics directly. The Spitfire's evolution was accelerated by the captured aircraft secrets. And morale, battered for months, surged again. Without Faber's accidental delivery, the RAV's tactical evolution would have taken far longer. One landing in Wales had helped restore parity in the skies. Angle 6 philosophical moral chance. Fate, and the war in the air. War history often celebrates grand strategies, heroic charges, and massive industrial shifts. But beneath the sweeping narratives lie small, fragile moments, human decisions, made in seconds that ripple outward with astonishing force. Armin Faber's mistake was one of those moments. He wasn't a traitor. He wasn't careless. He wasn't attempting to defect. He was a trained, dedicated Luftwaffe officer who simply misread the world beneath him during the chaos of a dogfight. A single navigational error, the kind any pilot could make, triggered a chain reaction that reshaped Allied understanding of their deadliest opponent. This wasn't sabotage. It wasn't espionage. It was fate, in its strangest wartime form. A coastline mistaken for another. A direction assumed rather than confirmed. A landing strip chosen with confidence, in the wrong country. Historians often debate how much this event influenced the broader air war. Some argue it accelerated Allied technological responses. Others point out that a Spitfire Mk IX would eventually counter the Fw 190 regardless. But what's undeniable is that Faber's landing gave Britain clarity at a moment of deep uncertainty. It proved that wars can pivot on the smallest hinge, the fragility of human perception, the unpredictability of combat, and the cruel humor of circumstance. And this hinge was about to turn sharply. As the events of that single day reached their dramatic peak, June 23, 1942, the day everything went wrong, morning broke clear over the English Channel, a calm, sharp light cutting across the sea, revealing a sky that looked harmless. But skies like these were deceptive. They were perfect for flying, and deadly for fighters who crossed paths. On the British side, RAF squadrons were preparing for another circus raid, a coordinated bomber strike intended to provoke Luftwaffe fighters into battle. The Czechoslovak squadrons 310, 312, and 313, flying Spitfires, warmed their engines at readiness. They had flown these raids many times before, escorting bombers toward rail yards, airfields, and industrial targets deep inside occupied France. Across the water at Morlex, the Luftwaffe was watching. Ground observers, coastal radar, and early warning stations tracked the incoming raid. A familiar urgency rolled through the fighter base. The scramble bell rang. Fw 190s of JG-2 Richthofen surged into life. Mechanics pulled chocks. Pilots sprinted from dispersal huts. Armin Faber, in his crisp flight suit and leather gloves, moved quickly but calmly. Moments later, he climbed into his Fw 190A-3, sealed the cockpit, and the BMW 801 radio roared awake beneath him. The fighters took off in tight succession, rising into the summer sky, circling once, then heading southeast toward the coast. Altitude was their ally. The Fw 190s climbed hard, powering toward interception height while the British formation approached from the Channel. The two forces converged over the coast of Brittany, the kind of meeting point that promised violence. At 20,000 feet, the battle began. The Czech Spitfires were first to engage. They spotted the German swarm rising beneath them, sunlight gleaming off the curved canopies of the Fw 190s. The Spitfires turned in with discipline, stacked formations, each pilot scanning his sector. Faber's group dove. The Fw 190 hit with its usual brutality. Its cannons spat fire, its roll rate allowing sudden slashing attacks the Spitfires struggled to predict. Within seconds, the sky became a storm of tracers, twisting formations, and spiraling contrails. Faber locked onto a Spitfire in a tight right turn. He pulled the stick, felt the G-force press against his chest, and fired. His burst struck home. The Spitfire shuddered, rolled, and began its fatal descent. It was a clean kill, but in scoring it, Faber made the first small mistake of the day. He followed his target too long, where German tactics emphasized brief, violent attacks and rapid disengagement. Faber chased deeper into the swirling melee. His wingmen moved to support, but in the chaotic tangle of climbs, rolls, and turns, separation occurred. As other aircraft peeled away or engaged new opponents, Faber slipped out of formation. By the time he climbed again to situational altitude, he was alone. He scanned the sky, no wingmen, only distant contrails. The RAF formation had scattered. The Germans had broken off into smaller dogfights. Faber banked his aircraft, searching for familiar shapes. Nothing. The sea stretched beneath him in a vast blue sheet, featureless and deadly. He checked his compass, steadied his breathing, and made a decision. Turn for home. It was a reasonable choice. He had fuel. He had altitude. He had survived the engagement and scored a victory. But at 400 miles per hour, the slightest misjudgment becomes catastrophic. Faber believed he was turning south, toward France. The coastline below curved exactly like the Breton Peninsula would from this angle, or so it seemed. The sun glinted from the west, just as it would if he were approaching home. Except he wasn't in the heat of combat. Faber had drifted north, crossing over the channel without realizing it. Now as he descended through patchy cloud and the landmass beneath became clearer, he saw green fields, hedgerows, and a broad coastline shaped like the one near Brest. He felt relief that he was home, but instead of Brittany, he was staring at the rolling landscape of South Wales. The Bristol Channel below was wide and blue. The far shore looked friendly. There were no immediate threats, no air defenses firing, no Spitfires in pursuit. Everything reinforced his belief that he was flying over German-controlled territory. He descended lower, scanning for an airfield. Minutes later, one appeared, long, straight, and perfect for landing. A small RAF station he didn't recognize. Its camouflage layouts resembling Luftwaffe patterns at a glance from altitude. It was RAF Pembrey. Faber lowered his landing gear, throttled back the engine, aligned himself with the runway, and eased the Fw-190 into a smooth, confident approach, completely unaware that dozens of British personnel were staring upward in disbelief. As the wheels touched British soil, the war shifted on its axis. And the moment the propeller slowed to a hum, Faber had unknowingly placed Germany's most potent weapon directly into the hands of the enemy. What happened in the next few minutes would become one of the most surreal moments of the entire air war. A German fighter rolls to a stop on British soil. The moment the Fw-190's wheels touched the runway, RAF Pembrey froze. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The ground crew simply stared at the aircraft rolling toward them, the broad wings, the thick radial engine, the stark black crosses gleaming in the sun. They knew exactly what it was. Every man on that field had seen recognition charts. Every man understood the impossible sight in front of them. An enemy fighter was landing at their airfield. The first to react was Sergeant Jeffries, the duty officer on site. With no time to arm himself properly, and no idea whether the pilot intended to fight, escape, or destroy the aircraft, he grabbed the closest thing at hand, a very flare pistol, and sprinted across the grass as the Fw-190 slowed to a taxi. Inside the cockpit, Armin Faber felt only relief. The landing had gone smoothly. The airfield looked familiar enough, and the personnel waiting near the dispersal area, well, he assumed they were Luftwaffe ground crew wearing oddly dark overalls. The airfield signage looked different, but he dismissed it as a variant in base design. He unlocked his canopy. Outside, the British watched in disbelief as the enemy pilot calmly prepared to disembark. No sign of distress, no attempt to break away. The engine dropped to an idle rumble, the propeller spinning lazily. Sergeant Jeffries reached the aircraft, climbed onto the wing, and thrust the flare gun directly into the startled pilot's face. For the first time, Faber hesitated. He looked at the flare pistol. He looked at the uniform. He looked at the unfamiliar insignia, and then the truth hit him like a physical blow. These were not German ground crew. This was not Morlex. This was not France. He had landed, perfectly, confidently, in enemy territory. The shock must have been indescribable. A trained officer, a combat veteran, a trusted adjutant of JG2. Now captured not in a dogfight, not in a crash, not in a desperate escape attempt, but in a pristine aircraft he had willingly delivered to the Royal Air Force. Faber raised his hands. The RAF men, still stunned, helped him out of the cockpit, disarmed him, and took him into custody. The flare gun had done its job. No battle, no resistance. Just a surreal exchange between two airmen caught in a moment neither could have imagined an hour earlier. Now the attention shifted to the aircraft. Ground crew swarmed the Fw-190 with a mixture of caution and awe. Mechanics circled it, touching the wings as if unsure it was real. Officers shouted orders to cordon off the area. Photographers were rushed in. This was an intelligence jackpot, something commanders had dreamed of but never expected. The Fw-190A3 sat gleaming on British grass, still warm from flight, its systems intact, its guns untouched. It was the first complete, flyable, undamaged Fw-190*** ever captured by the Allies. At that exact moment, telephones were ringing in operations rooms up and down the chain of command. Messages were marked urgent, coded, transmitted directly to intelligence groups. Within hours, high-level RAF officers were aware of what had occurred at Pembrey. Meanwhile, Faber was escorted into the base, still processing the enormity of his mistake. He answered basic identification questions mechanically, shock settling deeper as each minute passed. He wasn't just a prisoner. He was the source of one of the Luftwaffe's greatest unintentional losses. Within the hour, a high-security recovery detail arrived. The Fw-190 was quickly inspected, its fuel isolated, armament checked for safety, and its systems locked. British intelligence officers who had only seen wrecked fragments of the Fw-190 before walked around it in silent wonder. Here was the machine that had tormented their pilots for a year. A machine that had seemed invincible. Now it was theirs. As the sun dipped over Wales that evening, the Fw-190 was loaded for transport. Under armed guard, it began its journey to Kutsakostu, RAF Pembrey, where engineers and test pilots were already preparing for its arrival. It would be studied, dissected, flown, and compared against the Spitfire Mk IX. It would reveal weaknesses, strengths, and secrets Germany never intended to share, all because one pilot had mistaken Wales for France, all because one quiet airfield had been in the right place at the right time. And as the convoy rolled away from Pembrey, taking with it the most valuable enemy aircraft capture of the European war, a single thought echoed. The balance of air power had just shifted, quietly, improbably, and irreversibly. Inside the enemy's best fighter, the convoy carrying the captured Fw-190 reached RAF Pembrey under secrecy and armed escort. For years, British engineers had begged for a chance to examine an intact German fighter. Now sitting before them, bolted to the back of a transport lorry, was not just any fighter, but the Luftwaffe's most formidable frontline machine. The aircraft was wheeled into a secure hangar at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, RAE, where only authorized personnel were allowed entry. The hangar doors shut behind it with a heavy metallic thud, sealing in a moment the RAF had waited nearly 12 months for. Then the real work began. Teams of engineers, technicians, weapons experts, and aerodynamic specialists approached the Fw-190 with a kind of reverent caution. It was the first time they could examine the German fighter without guessing, without relying on fragmented wreckage or pilot reports. They walked around it slowly, taking in the clean lines, the wide landing gear, the powerful stance of the radial engine. Everything looked purposeful, rugged yet refined. This machine had been designed to dominate. The first task was documentation. Every inch of the airframe was photographed. Every panel line was traced. Every access hatch was opened. The weapons bays revealed their secrets: ammunition feeds, cannon mountings, harmonization settings, electrical safeties. The British had lost countless pilots to these guns. Now they could finally understand their layout and performance. Then came the heart of the machine, the BMW 801 radial engine. Engineers studied its cooling baffles, turbocharger layout, fuel injection system, and oil circuitry. The British had assumed the engine sacrificed high-altitude performance for ruggedness. Now they could prove or disprove it. Next, they evaluated the cockpit. Sliding into the German pilot's seat, RA test pilots examined every instrument. The layout was cleaner than expected, intuitive even. The gun sight impressed them. The visibility over the nose surprised them. The Fw-190 had been built with clear focus on pilot ergonomics, something Allied designers studied with newfound respect. Then the aircraft was repainted, adorned with RAF roundels, given the serial number MP499, and marked with a large black P for prototype. The Fw-190 looked bizarre, a German thoroughbred wearing British colors. But its next role required it. On the 3rd of July 1942, just 10 days after its accidental arrival, MP499 took to the skies again, this time under British control. The first test flight was cautious. The pilot advanced the throttle gently, feeling the torque of the radial engine, the vibration of German engineering. The Fw-190 lifted off gracefully, gaining altitude with ease. Test notes flowed rapidly: roll rate, exceptional stability, solid, responsive, climb at low altitude, superior to the Spitfire Mk V, visibility, excellent beyond the engine cowl, power response, immediate. The aircraft performed exactly as RAF pilots had described in combat, except now they were measuring it with instruments, not fear. Over the following days, the RA pushed the aircraft harder. They tested stall characteristics, dive behavior, maximum speed, sustained turns, and engine temperature stability. They fired its weapons under controlled range conditions, analyzed recoil forces, and studied how the aircraft handled under load. Every test revealed data the RAF desperately needed, but the most important revelation was this: Germany's advantage with the Fw-190 was real, and it was significant. Yet now, for the first time, the RAF understood why, and more importantly, how to counter it. Once the GA completed their evaluation, the aircraft was transferred to the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford, where mock dogfights would change the course of aerial combat. This was the turning point, the moment when intelligence became strategy. The Fw-190 had been a terror, now it was a tool. A captured blueprint for victory. And the consequences of that transformation were about to spread across the air. War like wildfire, from Wales to Canada and the wider war at the Air Fighting Development Unit, AFDU, at Duxford. The captured Fw-190 became the most in-demand aircraft on the base. Pilots who had once feared the machine now approached it like a rival they could finally study and defeat. The AFDU's mission was simple: test the Fw-190 against the newest Spitfire variants, gather tactical data, and rewrite the RAF's combat doctrine. The timing was ideal. The Spitfire Mk IX, equipped with the powerful Merlin 61 engine, had just begun entering service. It was Britain's answer to the Fw-190. But until now, no one knew how the two would truly compare. The results were immediate and decisive. In mock dogfights, the Spitfire Mk X proved capable of meeting the Fw-190 on equal terms. Sometimes it excelled. Sometimes the Fw-190 still held the upper hand. But the era of German superiority was over. For the first time in a year, RAF pilots felt the playing field leveling beneath their wings. Detailed tactical notes were produced. Force the fight vertical. The Spitfire climbed. Better than the Fw-190 at medium to high altitude. Avoid flat turns. The Fw-190 could outroll and snap turn faster. Exploit high altitude. Performance. The Merlin 61 thrived where the BMW 801 began to strain. Never chase an Fw-190 straight down. Its dive acceleration exceeded the Spitfire's tolerances. These findings were rushed to frontline squadrons, rewritten into pilot training manuals, and distributed across fighter command. For the RAF, this was not merely information, it was survival. By late 1942, the RAF was no longer being outclassed. By early 1943, they were winning again. Much of that shift traced back to a single landing on a remote Welsh runway, Faber's personal aftermath, while the Fw-190 transformed British air strategy. Armin Faber faced a very different fate. After interrogation in Britain, he was transferred to a Canadian POW camp, as many Luftwaffe officers were. His capture was deeply embarrassing for the Luftwaffe hierarchy. A respected adjutant delivering a top-secret fighter to the enemy was a scandal that could not be publicly acknowledged. In captivity, Faber became known as a quiet, disciplined prisoner. He made one escape attempt, unsuccessful, and was eventually hospitalized due to illness. His war ended far from home, watching from behind barbed wire as the conflict he had once fought at its sharpest edge shifted against Germany. Years later, Faber reportedly expressed remorse for his mistake, not ideologically, but professionally. He had been a skilled pilot, trained to the highest standards. To be remembered for a navigational error was a burden he carried long after the war ended, yet history is indifferent to personal shame or pride. It records events by impact, not intention. And Faber's mistake had an impact few wartime errors ever achieve. The fate of the captured Fw-190 after months of testing. MP-499, the ex-Luftwaffe Fw-190A3, flew a total of 29 sorties under British control. Each flight added another layer of understanding. Each report refined pilot training. Each mock dogfight sharpened Allied combat doctrine. But by 1943, the aircraft had served its purpose. New models of Spitfires were rolling out. Technical intelligence had been extracted. Strategies were changed. The air war had moved on. The once feared machine was dismantled for parts and eventually scrapped. A quiet end for a fighter that had changed so much, yet fragments survived. A windscreen here. A cockpit panel there. A few relics maintained in aviation museums. Pieces of a machine whose greatest battle had been landing on the wrong runway. A subtle but far-reaching shift. Some historians argue that even without the captured Fw-190, the RAF would eventually have adapted. Perhaps the Spitfire Mk IX would have arrived in time. Perhaps engineers would have guessed correctly. But those are hypotheticals. What did happen is clear. The RAF got answers months earlier than expected. Those answers saved lives. The balance of air superiority over Western Europe shifted faster. And all because a single pilot, in a moment of disorientation, turned north instead of south. From Wales to Farnborough to Duxford. The ripples of that moment spread across the entire air war. One landing. Many consequences. History often magnifies the grand strategies, invasions, offensives, political decisions, while the small, accidental moments drift quietly into obscurity. Yet war is full of these moments. Tiny, human-sized events that shift the trajectory of nations. Armin Faber's wrong turn was one of them. It didn't look like a turning point. There was no explosion, no dramatic duel, no heroic sacrifice. Just a single fighter, descending through calm Welsh air, landing softly on an enemy runway under a puzzled summer sun. And yet that moment carved a permanent mark into the story of the air war. The Fw-190 had entered the conflict like a phantom, faster, deadlier, and more agile than anything the RAF had in 1941. It shocked Allied pilots, destroyed veteran aces, and injected deep doubt into the heart of British fighter command. Understanding it wasn't a luxury. It was a matter of survival. Faber's landing gave the RAF something priceless. Clarity. Clarity about performance. Clarity about design. Clarity about how to fight and how not to fight against Germany's finest machine. From that clarity came confidence. From confidence came new tactics. And from those new tactics came the resurgence of Allied control in the skies. But this story is more than a technical victory. It is a reminder of the unpredictability of human endeavor. Faber wasn't inexperienced, reckless, or incompetent. He was a trained Luftwaffe officer performing his duty in the chaos of combat. His mistake was the kind any pilot could make in the fog of adrenaline and exhaustion. War, however, is not a forgiving teacher. His misjudgment became a lesson for the enemy. A gift wrapped in confusion, delivered by fate, and decades later, when Faber visited a museum and quietly handed over his wartime dagger and pilot's badge, he stood face to face with the machine he had once flown, a silent acknowledgement that history had carried his name far beyond the cockpit he once commanded. One landing, one moment, one shift in the balance of air power, a reminder that even in a global conflict shaped by millions, a single set of wheels touching the wrong way can change the war. If you want more true stories that shaped the Second World War in unexpected ways, subscribe and stay with us. History is never finished, and neither are the lessons it leaves behind.